Hello, this is Dr. Anthony Delmond. We've been discussing the elements of verbal communication. We're going to stop now and start talking about the difference between hearing and listening, and then we'll move on to nonverbal communication. Let me start by saying right up front that hearing and listening aren't the same. Hearing involves sounds that you perceive, but that you're not necessarily attaching meaning to. So you're not going through any decoding process when you just hear things. Those are just things that go in and out of your ears. You recognize they're there, but you're not trying to translate them into concepts. Listening incorporates a decoding process and assigns meaning to the sounds that you hear. We should also draw a distinction between implication and inference. To imply something is to strongly suggest something or some meaning. This is done by the speaker. So someone can imply some additional information, but it's up to the receiver to infer, which is to interpret that information in a certain way, whether it's intended by the speaker or not. So that's done by the listener. So a speaker will imply some idea, and it's up to a listener to infer what the speaker is saying, whether or not there were any true implications. There are 4 levels of listening that we're going to talk about in this course. The first is marginal listening. This marginal listening involves minimal attentiveness. You're not paying very much attention. Maybe you're doing something else while you're watching this lecture. Selective listening is where you sift through the information, but you only decode the pieces that you want to decode. We can think of this in terms of selective listening to what your parents are asking you to do. You're going to pay more attention when it's things that you're interested in. Active listening involves full engagement with the speaker's content and a significant degree, if not full, understanding. We typically think of this as the highest level of learning, but there is a level beyond that, and that is empathetic listening. Empathetic listening is where you're actively listening to someone, but you're also trying to consider the speaker's point of view and motivations, so you're making additional inferences. So the highest level of listening is probably empathetic listening, where you're trying to take the incentives and intentions of the speaker into account. So again, that goes from the lowest level to the highest level. Retention involves how well someone commits information to memory so they can later retrieve it and apply it. This is really important in the sales process. You want your customers to be able to retain as much information as possible so that they're aware what the implications are for them purchasing a product. Unfortunately, over time, retention decreases pretty rapidly. So what you tell somebody now, a day, 2 days, 4 days, a week, they're not going to remember nearly as much of what you told them originally. So what can you do as a salesperson to make sure people retain as much information as possible? Well, using multiple media and sales presentations is crucial. People only retain a small portion of what they hear. They retain more of what they see, but they retain the most of what they both see and hear. And we can add touch and engage with to that as well. So the more verbal engagement you get, the more nonverbal engagement you get, the better off you'll be. So you're going to maximize your customer's ability to retain information by maximizing your sensory elements of your presentation. So you want to make sure that they can see, hear, and feel all the things in your presentation so that they retain them. All right. Moving on, we want to sort of recap this and formalize it. So how can a salesperson verbally engage customers and prospects? Well, tailoring and framing, very important. We discussed those previously. Asking questions to bring the customer into the conversation, making sure that he or she understands exactly what's going on, and to make sure that they're engaged. Using a narrative, so if you tell a story, your customer is going to retain more of that than if you just tell them something abstract. It boosts cognitive engagement. Consider the difference between telling somebody raw facts or weaving those facts into a story. We've all had an experience reading very dry material, and we've all had experience reading an engaging story. Which one is the one you retain? Typically the story. So if you can tie the facts that you want somebody to know into a story and frame it that way as a narrative, you'll be much more successful in getting them to remember and pay attention. All right. From here, we're going to move on and talk about nonverbal communication. So what you say is important. How you say it can be a lot more important. In the 1960s, Albert Mehrabian developed something called the 738-55 rule, which says that people internalize a message based 7% on the verbal or word component, 38% on the voice and inflection, and 55% on the facial expressions someone had. So, in other words, nonverbal elements make up about 93% of people's internalization of a message. This is really important. Now, this has been shown to be not quite accurate, but it's a good rule that we still kind of use as a guideline. We won't be able to talk about all of the forms of nonverbal communication in this course because you could have a whole course just on that. But some of the main areas are eye contact, hand gestures and body movements, posture, facial expressions, proximity, so the distance between those who are discussing things, and paralanguage. And we'll go through each of these in turn. Eye contact is very important. Maintaining that connection with somebody lets them know that you're invested and engaged, and it sort of convinces them to also be invested and engaged. So as a salesperson, maintaining eye contact is important. As a receiver, you're giving eye contact back to the sender to make sure that they know you're engaged. So it's a reciprocal sort of process. But you want to make sure you're paying attention to that connection. Just staring at somebody without turning away at all can be a little bit distracting. So you want to make sure that you are giving the right amount of eye contact. Too little eye contact, obviously it's going to indicate that you're disinterested, but too much can make somebody think that you're pretending to be interested, or that it's a power play and you're trying to stare them down. You don't want somebody to feel like they're in a staring contest, but at the same time, you want to make sure that it's friendly, active eye engagement. Hand gestures are important. Some are really easy to read. Thumbs up's pretty easy to read. Nodding somebody's head. If your arms are crossed or your legs are crossed, that typically indicates that you're feeling a little bit defensive. So not always the best sign. If you're scratching your head, or if your hand's on the back of your head, that usually indicates that you're confused or generally upset. And then turning and walking away obviously is a sign that you're no longer interested or completely have disengaged. But some are a little bit more confusing. Shaking the head with your eyes closed and prayer hands might be something that you have no idea what to do with. And there's certainly other things that can lead to some confusion. So it's worthwhile to consider some of these specific positive hand gestures and body movements. Nodding the head, uncrossed arms or legs, generally a good sign. Leaning forward, if you're leaning toward the speaker, that's usually a good sign if you're sitting. Maybe not as much if you're standing up, but feet pointing toward the speaker. You're generally engaged with somebody when your feet are pointing toward them. Think about that. The next time you're really engaged and you're standing up with someone, see if your feet are pointing directly toward them. Relaxed posture, calm breathing. When your hands are disengaged, so they're not moving or grabbing anything, they're not grabbing your elbows or scratching your head. And then, of course, making affirmative motions, nodding the head, or just generally smiling. Those are affirmative motions. On the other end, there are some negative movements. Shaking the head, the exact opposite of nodding, right? Crossed arms or legs, leaning back away from the speaker. Again, this is more simple to see when you're sitting down. When your feet are pointing away from the speaker. Now, you want to kind of think about this in terms of the direction of the speaker. If they're not pointing directly at the speaker, it doesn't necessarily mean you're getting a negative feedback, but feet going very much away from the speaker is not a great sign. If the person's tense, you can see their posture's tense. If they're looking away and trying to escape the room, when people touch their face repeatedly, that's usually a sign that they are either disengaged or unhappy. And then tapping or fidgeting, picking at something, making noise. When they seem nervous, that's usually a bad sign also. Again, body language can be hard for beginners to read in the context of selling, so you want to take them in conjunction with the other nonverbal signals like facial expression, paralanguage, and verbal signals. Saying, yes, yes, I get it, obviously is a pretty good sign. So we're going to move on next to talk about some of the other nonverbal communication techniques, but I think this is a good place to stop temporarily.